Welcome to The Blitz, a podcast from Coram Deo Church. The Blitz is all about tackling tough topics head-on at full speed. Are you ready? Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good whatever time of the day it is that you happen to be checking out this episode of this podcast. My name is John. I'm the lead pastor of Coram Deo Church, and I will be your host today on The Blitz. Well, once again, we are dealing with issues that uniquely come up in the month of June because June has been declared Pride Month. And so everywhere you go, everywhere you look, you see rainbows, you see the LGBTQ agenda being rammed down your throat. And so what we're doing is we're taking some time to respond to unique questions and issues and challenges that arise that Christians have to navigate and face during this month. And these things become more important as the agenda becomes more pervasive, and Christians are not expected simply to tolerate, but are encouraged to celebrate it and look down upon if they do not participate in celebrating Pride Month. So we're trying to deal with some of the issues that are inevitably going to come up, responding to questions and just things that people got to deal with. So here's what we're going to deal with this morning. Should Christians support or celebrate Pride Month? All right. Is it appropriate for a Christian to celebrate Pride Month? And the answer coming right out of the box is no. No Christian should have anything to do with celebrating Pride Month. And let me unpack why I'm going to say that, and maybe we're gonna maybe go a direction you haven't thought about before. Years ago, when I was planting our church, this was 2004. Tim Keller was kind of skyrocketing to prominence as a speaker, as a thinker, and not just as a theologian, but somebody who was thinking about culture and mission and church planting and all that stuff. Thinking about theology in that context, in that sphere. And so one of the things that Tim Keller was known for, one of the drums that he kept beating over and over and over again, was the text in Jeremiah 29, where God's people have been carried into exile into Babylon, and Jeremiah speaks to them. And in essence, he says, hey, this is part of God's plan, and you need to seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you. So their exile was part of God's sovereign plan, his design for the history of Israel. And while they were living in exile, which would not be forever, but while they were there, they were to seek the peace and the prosperity of the city. And so myself, and I'm assuming a lot of other people, heard that and just thought, gosh, this is a really great way to think about our missional calling in the context of our own culture. We are to seek the peace and the prosperity. We are to seek the shalom of the city to which we are called into. So that means wherever you're at, right? Whatever city you're in, part of what the church is called to do is to seek the well-being of that city. Okay. Now, if you just leave it right there, it can kind of sound like churches need to participate in the programs and the initiatives, and if they don't exist, perhaps need to create those things that serve to improve the overall city, the overall welfare, the well-being, the shalom, that is things being right in the city. And of course, Christians should be doing that. We should be giving ourselves to the betterment of our communities. But here's the rub, and I don't know that Keller ever went there. And in fact, as I look back, I'm actually quite frustrated that he never went there, or maybe he did, and I just haven't heard it or read it. So feel free to push back on me. I'm open to that. But there's a question that statement, that verse begs, especially if you just take that verse face value and don't consider anything else around it, okay? We're supposed to seek the peace and the prosperity of the city, the shalom to which we live. Of course, that involves things like justice and human rights and dignity and all of that stuff, okay? But here's the question. By whose standard? Right? We're supposed to seek the peace and the prosperity of the city to which we've been sent. But the city does not define the standard of what human flourishing looks like. The city does not define the standard of what justice looks like. The city does not define the standard of what shalom or prosperity or well-being looks like. Those definitions, those categories are defined. Those standards come from the scriptures. So when you take a Jew out of their own land and you carry them in captivity back to Babylon, and then they're told by Jeremiah to seek the peace and the prosperity of that city, they're not thinking, okay, we're just adopting the values and the norms and the definitions of the city, but we are bringing with us God's standard, God's definition, God's ideas of justice, and we're to seek those things for the city. And here's what that does. Because when you hear seek the peace and the prosperity of the city, it almost sounds like that God's people can do this without any sort of conflict. It's just a total partnership with the city, seeking the welfare of the city. But that is absolutely impossible. There are spheres, perhaps, where this can happen, but as a whole, it's impossible for that to happen without some sort of conflict, because God's people are to pursue God's definition of human flourishing, God's conditions for human flourishing, God's definition and standards for justice. They're supposed to pursue that in the city to which they have been called to. And that cannot happen without some sort of conflict, because in Babylon, there is an idea, right, of human flourishing. There is an idea of justice. There is an idea of liberty and freedom. And of course, God's definition and standards of that are going to be different. And so there is inevitable conflict baked into Jeremiah 29. I don't know how else to see it, okay? So once you understand that God's people are to seek human flourishing and justice and welfare in their local communities as defined by the scriptures, then you're going to have the bearings. You're going to have the eyes to see that, you know what, this is going to involve conflict. So if there is an area in which our city is seeking health and flourishing, and it's seeking that in a way that is consistent with biblical standards and norms, then the church doesn't have to enter into conflict there, but can actually serve there and aid the city and partner with the city in that particular area. However, it's an inescapable reality that the church is going to have conflict in particular areas, because the city to which we have been called, right, is going to have definitions and ideologies and values that are inconsistent with biblical justice and a biblical notion of human flourishing. And one of the areas where this collision is unavoidable today is in the area of LGBTQ. It is the sexual revolution that is taking place. In order for the church to seek justice and human flourishing in the city, the church is going to have a prophetic voice that calls out destructive ideologies and behaviors. Okay? We're going to have to call that out in order to seek human flourishing in our community, right? Which means we cannot endorse or support or participate in agendas that are at their core inescapably destructive. Okay? Now, some of you may be going, gosh, that just sounds so divisive. Here's the thing. Some things are divisive. You can't escape it. But let me flip the script a little bit on you and help you to see how incongruent, how inconsistent it would be for Christians to support LGBTQ plus agendas and Pride Month. Okay? Let's assume that Pride Month wasn't about LGBTQ plus. Let's assume that Pride Month was about adultery. And the whole month was set apart to understand the values of adultery, the language and vocabulary of adultery, the stories of adultery, and to acknowledge and celebrate those who have embraced adultery as their lifestyle. Okay? So think about that for a moment. Pride Month is now about adultery. And so what we need to do is we need to celebrate people who intentionally violate their wedding vows, who crush their spouses by cheating on them, who abandon their families, right? We need to celebrate this because that's what June is all about. It's all about Adultery Pride Month. Now, when you flip the script that way, you go, well, of course we couldn't do that. We couldn't participate in that because look at all the pain that is caused by adultery. Look at what that does to people. Look at what that does to a community. Look at what that does to children. Look at, right? And you could go on and on about all the destructive things that are associated with adultery. And so you couldn't possibly endorse a behavior and participate in a month that is celebrating something that is so clearly destructive, and God has called it wrong, right? And if it's good for the goose, friends, it's good for the gander. The church cannot endorse and celebrate behaviors and ideologies that are destructive to individuals and destructive to communities, right? That does not mean we cannot love our neighbor who is identifies as somebody who's part of the LGBTQ community. What that means is we cannot support, embrace, participate in the celebration of this godless ideology and this behavior that brings so much sorrow and destruction upon those who participate in it. And the reason that we cannot participate in it is because we are against them, right? It's actually the opposite. We are to seek the human flourishing of this community. We want to see people flourish as God has defined it. And to flourish in that sense means to flourish, to be aligned with God's intention for humanity, to be in line, to be congruent with God's design for human sexuality. And so we cannot participate in these things. We cannot endorse these things because we are for these people as individuals. We want to call them to human flourishing. We want to call them to God's standard of justice and holiness. We want to call them to God's design for their life and for their body and for their joy. And so therefore we cannot support and endorse ideologies and movements that stand in direct opposition to human flourishing, right? We have to oppose this ideology for their sake because we want more for them. When we stand in opposition to Pride Month, it's not because we want less for people who identify as LGBTQ. It's because we want more for them. We want more joy. We want more life. We want more flourishing. And those things are not to be found in opposition to the Creator, but rather those things are found when we are aligned with our Creator and the way that He has uniquely designed our bodies and what He has called us to in the terms of sexuality. So we, the church, cannot support Pride Month. We can't endorse it. We can't we can't participate in it. Why? Because our job is to seek the well-being of this community. And that well-being is defined by the scriptures. And so in love and compassion, we have to call a people back to a biblical standard. We have to call them back to faith in Christ, to repentance of sins, and to a life of obedience, and to union with God, because it's in God's presence that there is an abundance of joy. So we cannot participate, we cannot endorse, we cannot celebrate. Why? Because we need to seek the human flourishing of this community, and therefore we cannot participate in those things which are inconsistent with God's definition of flourishing. All right, I hope that was clarifying and helpful for you. If not, you can always let me know. I'd love to hear from you. Until next time, take care.